affirm, our sole contention is losing interest. Current national debt is reaching precarious levels. Red and whites of the business insider rights. Failure to address our long-term fiscal situation has increased the national debt to over $20 trillion, the highest in history. Despite losing government revenue, however, Congress will continue running up the deficit. The New York Times reports, after embracing $1.5 trillion in debt by slashing taxes on corporations and wealthy families, Republican leaders in Congress pushed through a 2-year budget deal that will increase spending by nearly $400 billion. Indeed, the idea that conservatives are more fiscally responsible is a myth. Daniel Mitchell of CNS News finds, after looking at domestic spending over 8 presidencies and 50 years, that Republicans generally reported much higher rates of domestic expenditures. National debt has risen to the point where simple solutions will not cut it. Gene Sahadi of CNN explains, there is abundant evidence showing that taxes must be part of the solution, however distasteful the GOP finds them. The looming debt problem is just too big, and reducing it by spending cuts alone would require draconian changes that would hurt the economy far more than a mix of spending and tax reform. Moreover, lawmakers trying to negotiate spending cuts this year alone were limited to a working range of between $10 billion and $61 billion. In the context of a $20 trillion check, this won't nearly be enough. These increases will specifically take the form of a financial transactions tax, or FTT, which is a tax on capital transactions used to selectively discourage excessive speculation. This is for 3 reasons. First, there are already plans to do so. Bauman of Mother Jones finds that proposals levying an FTT as a way of discouraging churn and raising revenue have already reached both the House and the Senate. Second, taxes in other areas have already been cut. Trump's 2017 tax bill specifically targeted corporate and income tax reductions. It would be entirely hypocritical to raise them 2 years later, so a tax on financial transactions is more likely. Third, the plan is politically popular. Glazier of the Wall Street Journal reports that the one thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree on is their hatred for Wall Street and major financial institutions. It is a politically expedient, bipartisan solution to implement an FTT. As such, affirming means taxing financial transactions, discouraging speculative spending, and high-frequency trading. Scheikman 14 explains that the speculation artificially drives up asset prices further and further until a frenzied sell-off causes prices to plummet and the bubble to deflate or burst. Absent a comprehensive plan to reduce debt, government interest payments will skyrocket. Collins 18 of USA Today explains that interest payments on U.S. debt are projected to total $7 trillion over the next decade, and by 2026 will become the 3rd largest category of the federal budget. Schwartz 18 of the New York Times contextualizes that interest payments will overtake Medicaid in 2020 and the Department of Defense budget in 2023. Problematically, this increase in mandatory spending constricts fiscal flexibility in times of economic downturn. Gilarducci 18 of Forbes explains that high interest payments limit the amount the government can spend on fiscal stimuli during a recession. The Economist 18 adds that as debt grows, fiscal stimuli will become even more important to recovery in the case of a looming recession. Unfortunately, a financial crash is coming. Fortune explains the economy has begun overheating, producing more than sustainable long-term potential. We are thus in the late cycle part of a catastrophic, massively unstable business cycle. The impact of ignoring our national debt is a global economic crisis. Any U.S. recession, regardless of the cause, spreads to the rest of the world. According to Friedman 17 of the Huffington Post, a recession would inevitably involve a drop in U.S. imports and outgoing investment, which destabilizes global economies, which have become excessively reliant on exports and FDI. Thus, the World Bank 10 reports that the recession of 2008 pushed 64 million people around the world into poverty. The longer we wait, the more there are at risk. The St. Louis Fed found that for each year of recession over the past 33 years, it has taken about 4 years of expansion for the gap to return to its pre-recession level, and thus we affirm.
I think they're running it on the Now we can run. Seconds.
anybody know there? We negate with one observation. The national debt isn't a risk. Kennedy in 2017 indicates that investors aren't remotely worried about the debt, furthering that we're heading toward a tech revolution that will bring massive wealth that will dwarf the debt. The 2017 House Budget Committee indicates that the best strategy toward decreasing the deficit is growing the economy. For every 0.1% of economic growth, the deficit is reduced by $270 billion. Our sole contention is protecting the poor. Sub-point A is preventing social program cuts. Reducing the debt is harmful because the U.S. must run budget surpluses to avoid adding to it. This would require deep cuts as the CBO in 2018 finds that the deficit hit $804 billion this year and will permanently breach $1 trillion in 2020 unless Congress cuts spending. Critically, Zelzer in 2017 observes that the GOP wants to cut federal health care and anti-poverty programs because of the deficit. While the right usually encounters backlash whenever they try to attack specific federal benefits, cutting budgets in the name of deficit reduction offers a less toxic mechanism for achieving the same goal. This approach will dominate debt reduction as Johnson in 17 writes that politicians, Democratic to conservative, complain America is running out of money when it comes to helping minorities, but it disappears when they talk about the military. Matthews in 2017 confirms, finding that Republicans want to cut health programs by 30% by 2027 and cut food stamps and anti-poverty programs by 15%. After a surplus is reached, funds must be reallocated to pay down the debt, further exacerbating these severe costs. The impact is lives. Matthew explains that the proposed $104 billion cuts to food stamps would cut 10 million people off. The CBPP in 2018 finds that federal funding cuts for Medicaid and the repeal of individual mandate will lead to a total coverage loss of over 20 million. This is deadly, as Himmelstein in 2017 finds that being uninsured leads to a 17% increase in the risk of death. Step B is growing marginalized economies. First is infrastructure. The ASCE in 2017 finds that the nation's overall infrastructure is in a state of deterioration and a strong risk of failure. Thus, Bernstein in 2017 writes that it's time to redirect infrastructure to support jobs and businesses that make our cities more productive and bring jobs and economic vitality to all the communities, even the poorest. Fortunately, Fuzangira on December 2nd explains that November elections spur optimism that a major infrastructure initiative is possible, one of the only areas of agreement among President Trump, Republicans, and Democrats. However, affirming sacrifices has the estimated cost of $4.6 trillion through 2025. Second is entrepreneurship. Lee and Tu finds that government policies such as subsidy programs targeting poor communities are incredibly effective in creating businesses with a 9.3% increase in entrepreneurship within the local community. Unfortunately, this would be jettisoned to reduce the debt. Perry in 2016 explains that incentivizing entrepreneurship in marginalized communities is key, as small businesses are more likely to hire from distressed communities, which often lack entry-level jobs. Sylvinsky in 2012 quantifies that every 1% increase in entrepreneurship decreases poverty by 2%. The impact is inequality. Welfare programs are critical to lift people from poverty, as Kenton in 2018 explains factors contributing to the poverty trap include a lack of healthcare and poor infrastructure. The extreme poor lack human capital and infrastructure, starting with a very low level of capital and getting trapped in poverty because capital per person falls from generation to generation. Rising costs from paying more for necessities exacerbate the cycle even further. Infrastructure growth alleviates inequalities and poverty. Austin in 2013 finds that increasing infrastructure spending would put millions to work, including hundreds of people of color. Infrastructure investments reduce unemployment gaps. These jobs are uniquely beneficial, as Bivens in 2014 explains that jobs created are disproportionately middle and high wage. Bottom wage unemployment accounts for just 9.5% of jobs created, compared with an economic-wide average of 18.9%. Thus, CNT in 2017 finds that new infrastructure strategies reduce the population living in poverty by 25%. Additionally, business ownership is key to reducing wealth inequality, as Evans in 2017 finds that being a business owner decreases the wealth gap between black and white adults by a multiplier of 13 to 3. Instead of eliminating entrepreneurship programs, we need to expand them, as it could reduce black employment to 5%. Overall, the IMF in 2016 quantified that fiscal consolidation of 1% of GDP increases long-term unemployment by 0.6%. Problematically, the CBO's latest projections indicate that the deficit will be 4.6% of the projected GDP in the fiscal year of 2019. Thus, attempting to reduce the debt requires a significant job loss due to decreased government spending, pushing more people into the cycle of poverty. Thus, we negate.
What is your advocacy for increasing economic growth?
Our advocacy for increasing economic growth is that we should implement infrastructure and entrepreneurship.
We should, or we
funding. That we should increase funding for infrastructure.
So are you saying that that's going to happen in the status quo, or you're doing something to make that happen?
Our evidence indicates that spending on the federal debt would decrease the amount of money that is able to go to infrastructure.
Okay.
And B, we think that by prioritizing economic growth, that means that these policies would be prioritized too. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So so the money that comes from the FTT goes to a financial security fund controlled by the Federal Reserve. How does it in turn create any sort of surplus?
What do you mean?
The
Decreases the
FTT
deficit by creating tax revenue.
No, it doesn't, because the funds from the FTT go directly to a federal security fund headed by the Fed. So how does it in turn lead to a budget surplus?
How is this in any way like responsive?
Because if it goes to the financial security fund headed by the Fed, then it doesn't go to the budget.
Okay, we'll respond to that in rebuttal if you bring it up.
Can you respond to it now?
Well, I'd like to respond to it in rebuttal. Can I ask you a question? Okay. So you say that Medicare is going to be cut by 2027, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So why do we need to like essentially prioritize economic growth for it to stop being cut? Or like, where's the uniqueness here?
Oh, okay, sure. The argument is not necessarily that it's going to be cut, but rather that Republicans are prioritizing cutting these.
Your evidence literally says that healthcare is going to get cut by 2027.
No, it says that if Republicans get their way, it would be cut that much, which is what happened in your way. Can I ask you a question?
Wait. Can we stay on this for a little bit? So you say that if Republicans get their way. So does that mean that after this resolution gets passed, then this is going to happen?
Yes.
So like your evidence itself says that healthcare right now is going to get cut by 2027.
No, it doesn't. It indicates that if Republicans get their way, what our argument is that when you prioritize debt reduction, then that gives Republicans the rhetoric required to like Okay, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay. The FTT was proposed in April 2017. If both parties are already signed on, then why hasn't it been implemented yet?
Why hasn't it been implemented?
Yeah, it was proposed in
Because
April
there hasn't been a
2017.
strong enough urge to prioritize reducing the national debt. The purpose of the FTT is to raise revenue to
Yeah, but
decrease the national debt.
so you said in case that both parties have signed on to it, so why hasn't it passed?
Well, they haven't really signed onto it. It's just that they support it more than any other tax. So we tell you that the only way to actually reduce the debt is a tax increase,
Sure.
right?
Why hasn't it been
viable
implemented
tax
yet?
increase?
Why hasn't it been implemented yet if there's all this support for it?
Because there hasn't been enough of an incentive to reduce the national debt. The purpose of the FTT is to reduce the national debt.
Okay, you can answer.
Okay. So on your second contention, on your second warrant about entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So how much does entrepreneurship increase with economic growth?
Sure. So our lead evidence indicates that the subsidy programs target poor communities and are incredibly effective, with a 9.3 increase in entrepreneurship within the local community.
I didn't catch the card name, but can I see just the card that specifically says entrepreneurship programs will be cut?
The argument is just that if you're prioritizing decreasing the national debt, then that would in turn mean that there's less funds.
Yeah, just a card that says this program would be cut. Alright, we'll take that. on their observation. They tell you that that investors aren't worried about us at a risk of default. First, I would tell you that investors aren't worried right now, but as we continue to drive up our debt, and as we aren't going to be able to pay our interest payments in the future, and we can't recover for recessions, investors are going to get really worried that debt is going to become an increasingly worse problem in the future. Then they give you this TAMI evidence. It says we're on the verge of a tech revolution. TAMI is really terrible evidence. TAMI just gives a guess as to why investors might not be worried and says maybe it's because there might be some hypothetical increase in economic growth in the future. It's really, really sketchy. Then they give this analysis that an increase in economic growth is going to reduce debt. However, we give you the scale and evidence that tells you that because of recent tax cuts, debt to GDP ratio is going to hit 111% in the near future. She continues that no achievable amount of economic growth is ever going to be able to reduce this debt. That is corroborated by a man who tells you that the growth of the debt is outpacing economic growth by 36%. Now let's go to their case about social spending. Start on their subpoint A about social spending. Two problems here. First, we tell you that spending cuts are not likely to amount to anything meaningful for two reasons. First, it simply isn't sustainable. Sahadi from Case explains that using spending cuts alone would lead to draconian harms to the economy, and the working range of cuts is between $10 billion and $61 billion. It isn't enough to offset the $20 trillion debt. Second, we tell you the federal government is becoming more bipartisan. With the House being controlled by Democrats, sheer cuts in social spending are unlikely, and Republicans have been cooperating with efforts to reduce more wasteful spending on things such as the military. That Francis 13 of Fiscal Times writes that the GOP has begun to embrace cutting military spending to advance their platform of reducing the debt. And second, we tell you in the long term, their case is going to be really non-unique because to know from Case that finds interest payments on the debt will in the next decade consume 50% of all tax revenue. The analysis is simple. If you reduce debt now, in the future the government pays less interest and has more money to spend on the programs such as Medicare that they talk about. In the long term, affirming means less cuts to these programs. Then finally, the impact is going to disprove the link. If you see that if these cuts are really so bad for people in America, politicians would not implement them because it would really harm their voter base. Now go to their subpoint B, learn the first thing about infrastructure. There are going to be two turns here that are going to be really important. First, infrastructure is going to perpetuate racism. Board of Texas Southern University writes that for the last few decades, racism has been the principal decision maker behind infrastructure-related policies in the U.S. Historically, the New York Times explains that government housing policies have pushed minorities into segregated inner cities with high poverty rates and few opportunities for escape. Continuing infrastructure spending will magnify this oppression, as someone of George Mason University observes that governments typically use new infrastructure projects as excuses to target and remove racial minorities. Thus, UC Santa Barbara confirms that federally assisted renewal projects destroy black housing units 2 times more often than white ones. And Hartman of the American Bar Association points out the cost of living of those forced out of their homes is 53% higher. Then second, infrastructure is going to harden the poor by creating a poverty trap. Glazer of Harvard asserts that the primary cause of central city poverty is public transportation. Nathaniel Baumstow of Brown University explains that transportation infrastructure plays a key role in influencing changes in the spatial distribution of the population in U.S. metropolitan areas, with each new highway causing central city population to decline by about 18%. The warrant is simple. Cuswell of Wayne State University explains that highways and other transportation structures serve as an escape hatch for wealthy citizens to live outside the city while still accessing the benefits, while underprivileged people cannot take advantage of this. This means that you're going to lock the poor up in inner city ghettos and worsen inequality. Thus, Riddick of Duke University warns that there is a robust connection between federal infrastructure expansion and concentration of poverty, which is why Glazer corroborates that regions within a mile of transit construction have poverty rates 4% higher. Now go to their second advocacy about entrepreneurial programs. I literally call for a card after First Cross that says these programs are going to get caught. They cannot provide me with this evidence. There's almost zero probability of this advocacy happening if literally no one has ever thought of it before they did. I would say it's a lot more likely that these cuts are going to come from programs that are more wasteful, such as the military. They give no advocacy of how this entrepreneurship is really going to change. Thus, sure.
to start at the top of our case. Is everyone good? All right. Start off on their first response. They tell you that they would get around and like the debt actually really matters a lot. But what we're telling you is that if what they were saying was true, as the debt increases, bonds would actually decrease. But bond ownership is increasing. That proves to you that investors don't actually care about the debt. Now let's go into where they talk about the debt to GDP ratio. We would actually answer this back by telling you that our claims about the TAMI evidence are actually super good. They indicate that when the discovery of coal happened, it made American workers 20 times more efficient. We would tell you that with new advances in automation, it would render the debt useless and insignificant because the economic growth would outpace the debt. That's why the debt to GDP ratio would be solved bad for. Now let's go into our first subpoint where we talk about social programs. They tell you that it's not sustainable and it wouldn't be enough, but that's exactly our argument. Cutting these social welfare programs wouldn't be enough, but that's the exact justification that Trump would use to cut these programs. If he knows he has a control over the Senate and the presidency, what he would do is use the deficit spending prioritization as a reason and justification to cut healthcare spending. That's why we would tell you that Medicare alone would be cut by 30%, and we would specifically tell you that we link to helping these disadvantaged populations because Medicare and these government programs are especially needed to help people in need. Now on their second term, where they tell you that they would just cut away wasteful spending to the military, we would tell you that that also is bad because archaic evidence indicates that when the United States decreases its military influence, it inherently means that unipolar rules are inherently worse because when we take away our security blanket to these other countries, which inherently makes them more nuclear. Now let's go into their payback arguments on our second contention. They tell you that infrastructure is bad because it's racist, but we would tell you that the alternatives are fundamentally worse. If their justification is used, then we would never do infrastructure spending as a whole. That's why our arguments, and literally at the bottom of our case, which they don't respond to, are Austin's evidence, Kent evidence, and Benton's evidence all indicate that people of color especially, and more importantly, disadvantaged people reap the benefits of infrastructure as they create millions of jobs, and our Austin's evidence, which is very good on this question, indicates that infrastructure spending alone has decreased poverty by 25%. That's why for every $1 put into infrastructure spending, you get $3 of economic output. That ultimately means that all of their claims go away. But then they talk about poverty, they talk about transportation. We would tell you two things with this. One, you prioritize public transportation. That's what infrastructure does. That levels the playing field. We're not just building highways for rich people. No, you improve the public transportation, which is bad for everyone. They need to uniquely tell you why that is bad. At this point, you go into the second impact about inequality. Extend Kenton, Austin, Bivens, and CNT. All of this goes unconceded. At this point, what we would tell you is if you prioritize infrastructure and spending through our petting your evidence, we clearly indicate that there would be a direct improvement in the people's quality of life. Now let's go into their first contention about interest. A couple of problems right off the bat. We would tell you, as Tammy concludes, that although the deficit is soared to a 20-fold, interest rates have declined by 8%. The implication is twofold. A, we should take advantage of the current low interest rates by borrowing more to enable us to improve the quality of our basic infrastructure, but B, we should not worry about prioritizing debt reduction until other countries start to hike up their interest rates. This ultimately means you can turn all your arguments because the people who control the interest rates are the other countries. If we prioritize debt reduction, that signals to countries like China and Japan, where we owe $4 trillion to, that, oh, this debt is a huge issue. That, in turn, would lead them to hike up their interest rates. They have no link into their FTT scenario. But now let's go to that. They give you three reasons as to why it would be likely. One, they tell you that there's already plans. That was a different Congress in April. We would tell you there's a new Congress right now. But then their second argument, they tell you that there's already a proposal right now. Exactly. If there's already been proposals and it hasn't gone through, that clearly indicates that there's no reason as to why it would go through now. But then they tell you it's politically popular. That makes no sense. Wall Street would hate this because the FTT would particularly decrease speculative investment, which Wall Street cares so much about, and we tell you that they would lobby Congress. But then even what Isaac alludes to in First Crossfire, this is particularly damning because it indicates that all of the money from the FTT just goes to the Federal Commission, which the Fed controls. It doesn't even link into reducing the deficit or debt at all. But now let's go into their argument about the global crisis. We would tell you that we solve that for recessions in two ways. If you establish that recessions are going to occur in either world, we tell you we would solve that, A, because infrastructure increases output by $3, and B, specifically on our scenario where we talk about healthcare, right? We would tell you that for every $1 in increasing food aid or SNAP funding, the economy generated $1.7 in economic activity. What this ultimately means is the welfare cuts that they talk about would not help the economy.
Let's talk about this TAMI evidence. So right after he's like, we're going to see this huge boom in productivity, what is the next sentence? He says, well, this is just a guess. what is his justification for this?
So is automation just never going to happen ever?
I mean, I would say that automation, like, maybe
Like, so
would happen,
independent
but
of
I would
Tammy.
say that it's really not going
So
to
let's
cause
forget
huge
Tammy.
productivity because there's always a limit on the amount of growth we can have without
Let's get on
productivity.
Tammy, right? So does automation occur or not?
I mean, I would say automation probably
Do we
might
make
occur.
developments
I mean,
as we
I don't
progress
really
in
know.
time, right? Okay, so-
Like, I don't study the, like,
Okay, yeah, so
history of
I can help you, right?
automation.
So coal, for example, when coal was like brought to the economy and used on a wide scale, that increased efficiency 20-fold. We would tell you that not if it's just automation, but like other economic developments would render our profits to be super high.
That
We
doesn't
would tell
really
you that we're on
respond
the
to the
verge.
Scanlon evidence. It
Can I have a
says that
question, though?
historically there's just a cap on the amount of achievable growth we can have without causing an overheat.
I'll take your question now.
Sure.
All right. Let's talk about the FTT.
Yeah.
The money generated from the FTT, if it goes to the Fed, and the Fed gets to determine what to do with it, how does it reduce debt?
I mean, one, I would say it probably
So you
wouldn't go to
would-
the it probably wouldn't go to the Fed because, like, I would say
That's
that the point.
fundamentally
I
what
mean,
it
the
does.
point of the FTT would be to increase revenue, right? That's why they do it. But
Right.
two,
Okay,
I mean,
so
we
if it's
don't
to
have
increase
to.
revenue, why hasn't it been
I
implemented
mean, two,
already?
we don't have to win FTT to win our case. We tell you
Okay,
that
that's,
from the
so we agree that you're not going to go for FTT.
I mean, sure, right? We tell you that from the Sahadi evidence that it's going to be a mix of spending cuts and tax raises. It doesn't necessarily have to be the FTT.
You have a
it's not
question
our evidence.
now that we've established that the FTT is not an argument you're going for.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of infrastructure spending.
Yeah.
So you say your link into like this income inequality is that it creates jobs for people of color. So if you concentrate minorities
that's just
in
like one word.
okay, well it's one of your words. So if you concentrate people minorities into inner cities, does that mean that they will have less economic opportunities?
Repeat that sentence.
We give you this. We tell you that it's going to create a poverty trap and it's going to concentrate
Alright,
minorities
so
into inner
can
cities.
you explain
Are there
to me-
less opportunities in inner
Can
cities?
you explain to me how like improving Chicago's public transportation systems is racist?
Sure. We tell you it's really simple. We tell you that because infrastructure projects like increase the cost of living and increase the opportunities for rich people to leave that area,
So-
you're going to concentrate poverty. So to
predominantly-
concentrate poverty, it's worse.
So if I own a Rolls Royce, do I take the public metro bus in Chicago? No, right? Rich people don't use public transportation. If we improve public infrastructure and transportation, that predominantly helps people who can't afford to have their own transportation.
Do you have a question?
You can have another.
Alright, there's 10 seconds left. How's your day been?
Pretty much.
I'm in semis. That's 32 seconds.
Sounds good.
So we have 2 minutes more, no, 1 minute 40 left. I'm gonna start on their case, go to ours and do some weighing. I'm gonna start with the long-term turn that we put on their first contention, and then go to the turn on the second contention.
Okay.
Is everyone good? On their first contention, they make a really big mistake. They concede the turn that we give you, which says that if debt is going to increase, it's going to actually come from social spending a lot more in the future, which means that the only way to actually solve for social spending happens in an affirmative world. But then, They also don't respond to the fact that if cuts are so bad, then politicians wouldn't actually cut from social spending, which means because they would lose their voter bases. But now let's go on to their second contention and the eternity review about the poverty trap. They respond to this by saying that they're going to prioritize public transportation. However, public transportation still triggers the impact of our term, and Glazier actually specifically talks about public transport because the reason is that when wealthier people move out of these cities, they're stuck. The poorer people are stuck in inner cities where they essentially like. These inner cities are a lot less developed, they get a lot less attention, which is why Glazier finds that poverty rates in these inner cities are 4% higher than in other places. But now let's go on to our case. They give you a bunch of responses about interest rates. Now, interest rates have declined. However, our argument is not that interest rates are going to increase. Our argument is that given the current interest rate, interest payments are taking more and more of our federal budget, which constrains our ability to pass fiscal stimulus. But the really easy, clean way to vote for us is on fiscal stimulus. We tell you that the debt is unsustainable, and Collins explains that interest payments will amount to $7 trillion over the next decade. And Giller-Jushi specifically explains that interest payments limit the amount the government can spend on fiscal stimulus. And Friedman explains that a U.S. recession would drop imports and destroy global economies. And according to the World Bank, the 2008 recession drove 64 million people globally into poverty. We are giving you the biggest number in today's round. They respond by saying they're solving back for recessions in two ways. However, both of these ways talk about economic growth. However, they never actually respond to Justin's analysis and summary and rebuttal, which is that economic growth can never actually solve back for the debt, because Scannell tells you that the debt to GDP ratio is going to reach 111%, and no amount of economic growth can ever solve for that. That's what Scannell says. But in addition, Mann tells you that the growth, the debt growth is outpacing economic growth by 36%, which means it's never going to actually solve. Here's how we weigh up against social spending. First, on time frames. Even if minimal amounts of social spending are cut now to reduce the debt, it's still a better alternative than letting the debt boil up so that it consumes so much of the federal budget, so it will require much larger cuts to spending in the near future. The second only prerequisite, because social spending decreases drastically during recessions, the best way to maintain the stability of social programs is to prevent and decrease the severity of recessions.
We see the transportation for whatever it is.
Which part? Glazier?
20%.
Yeah.
And we're still running preference.
We'll stop. Is it okay if Justin pulls it up on his because my Microsoft Word is frozen?
good.
Where you start?
First subpoint. On the outside. No, it's not just from there. Okay. Starting off on our first subpoint, recognize that they don't extend a single way that we can create a budget surplus. That means that you default to our austerity arguments that the only way to create a surplus would be through austerity measures. These massive austerity measures mean that there would have to be cuts across the board. That would include Medicare and social spending. Now the weighing here is pretty simple because we are able to cut back on massive austerity cuts that are happening in their world. They don't have any advocacy as to how we can offset those costs in theirs. Recognize that interest rates are only a percentage of the debt, not the full debt, which ultimately means that you have to, the trade-off is far less in our world. Also, they consider our military spending good argument. Archaic evidence indicates that funding needs to be commensurate with our role in the world. Absent spending is seen as a sign of weakness that invites imposing powers. That archaic evidence indicates causes of the next world war. Now, moving on to our second subpoint. Their turn about how it's about wealthy people leave. That doesn't make any sense. Also, it's convoluted, and the evidence concedes that's only anecdotal. However, the grants that we are able to give toward infrastructure development are not good because they can see the internal link into that. That means that you can clearly extend our impact evidence. It's not contested. It ultimately outweighs their turn because our Austin evidence indicates that infrastructure spending would put millions of people to work. That also allows us to get out of a recession because if all these people are working, that's how we got out of the Great Depression when FDR did tons of infrastructure development. Also, extending our evidence that every $1 we spend on infrastructure, it gives us $3 in economic output. That also comes back into recession arguments. Also, recognize that every time we invest in infrastructure to decrease poverty by 25%, that's the cleanest internal link to all the poverty arguments and, at the very least, mitigatory defense against their recession arguments. Moving on to their side. Extend the SNAP evidence that $1.7 spent on food stamps leads to a 1.7% economic output. The evidence that this ultimately means that we are able to get out of a recession because of so much of every single dollar that we spend on our world ends up cutting back against the decline that would happen in theirs. Also recognize that at the very least this is conceded mitigatory defense that allows us to easily outweigh a magnitude on our side because we have the cleanest internal link into poverty reduction.
So it's on economic growth, right? What? It's about economic growth, right?
So our evidence indicates that even outside of times of recession, infrastructure spending is good. But particularly in times of recession, it is even better, and we ought to prioritize infrastructure.
I don't think you're necessarily responding to my question. My question is, your entire warranting for why infrastructure is going to help us recover from the next recession. It's through economic growth, right?
Well, generally, how you get out of recessions is by helping
by stimulating the economy.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, so let's talk about your arguments on stimulus packages, right? Okay. So if you were to cut the tax, can you cut it again once you hit a recession?
Say that again?
So if you were to cut impose tax cuts, can you cut those taxes again once you are in a recession?
I mean, the stimulus package isn't really about tax cuts.
What is it about?
The stimulus package, like the one in 2008, is where the government literally just spent and invested in the private sector in order to stimulate economic recovery. It's not tax. It's not tax
bailouts, right? Yeah. By increasing the deficit. We got out of recession. It's not by doubling down.
Sure, but yeah, if we have a super high deficit, then we would not have the political capital.
We had a super
the
high deficit in 2008.
No, we had 67% debt to GDP in 2008. That is not anywhere near what
you're talking about. How is that even?
I mean, if we have super high debt, people are like, oh, well, maybe we should spend a little bit less. We don't
we're in the recession.
But it's also the idea that there's just first off, you never respond to this in the round. It's really new in Grand Cross. Second, we tell you that we just wouldn't have the capability or the capacity to if we're spending on interest payments, right? There are two warrants.
You have a question?
Alright, sure. So let's talk about this idea of infrastructure payments. I'll ask the same thing that I asked in second crossfire that doesn't really get into responded to well.
Okay.
So if you're concentrated in inner cities, do people have less opportunity?
Okay, so two problems. I asked you a question, and I said, how does improving Chicago's public infrastructure inherently lead to racism? That same question still applies.
Because more people are moved, like the wealthier people are moving out
Yeah,
of
so
inner cities
your arguments
because
are about suburbs,
they can
right?
spend more in suburbs.
Yes, it talks about like white flight to suburbs, right? If I am making conditions better in the inner cities that you tell me are so defunded, how is that racist?
You are not making the
No,
better in the inner
because
cities.
you have to see
Because
the
what you're talking about is transportation, right? And in transportation only allows the wealthy people to get out of the city because they're the only ones who can afford to live in the
Wealthy
suburbs.
people don't use buses, they use jets.
They don't like Uber everywhere.
Mercedes, things like that.
They don't Uber because they have their own cars.
I'm like 90% sure they don't take the subway.
Also, they go to the suburbs because it's better there. It's like nicer.
Yeah, maybe.
That's not permanent to anything.
Alright, we'll take the rest of it.
Is that like near not like
It's kind of like
is it just broken?
yeah.
Yeah.
Use ours.
It'll work. Prime condition.
I will figure this out.
It's in prime condition.
It is fun.
Also, that's just meetings.
You should move it back a little bit so it doesn't fall.
Okay, gonna just start their case, our case, Alright, everyone ready? Let's start on their subpoint A. They do not respond to the no evidence that says in the long term interest payments are going to make up 50% of all revenue for the government. They only try to outweigh. They say they outweigh a magnitude because it's only a percentage of the debt. However, we tell you that these short-term cuts that they are talking about are going to decrease the debt, which will increase our fiscal flexibility in the long term. That means over a long period of time, you're going to have more money to spend in these social programs. That also links into their analysis about the World War II. World War III, I don't even know what that is about. But it also links in their analysis about recessions, because if you're going to see more cuts from the SNAP in the long term, you're going to see worse recessions. Now go to their subpoint B about infrastructure. We give this analysis that tells you that investment in infrastructure allows for urban flight. So people are going to move out to the suburbs because now they have a better, more efficient way of getting back to the inner cities with public transportation. This is really bad because it concentrates poverty. It causes a 4% increase in poverty. Glazer specifically says this is public transportation. We tell you if people are concentrated in inner cities, they won't have the opportunities that they talk about. At best, this is a wash. If anything, you should vote for us off that. But now we'll to the cleanest place you can sign your ballot, and that's going to be on fiscal stimulus. We tell you that interest payments are rising so much right now that we will not have the money to spend on fiscal stimuli in the next recession. And Friedman says that because we were not able to recover from the next recession, it would drop imports and destroy global economies. And the World Bank says that the 2008 recession drove 64 million people into poverty. The only response that they extend at the end of this round are the links in. The first link in is from infrastructure. However, they specifically, their link in is that infrastructure increases output. But we tell you that economic growth isn't going to be able to solve for the debt, because we tell you that debt growth is outpacing GDP by 36%. That means if you can't solve for the debt, we can't stimulate the economy, we can't recover from the recession, the link in doesn't work. Second is the link in about SNAP. Realize we already turned that, that's a reason to vote for us. Now here's how we outweigh. First is going to be on time frame. Even if minimal amounts of social spending are cut now to reduce the debt, it is a better alternative than letting the debt boil up such that it consumes so much more of our budget in the long term. Second is going to be prerequisite. Realize social spending decreases drastically during recessions. The best way to maintain the stability of social programs is to reduce the frequency and severity of recessions. Thus, at first.
We'll move on with the 30 seconds that we had.
Alright. It's going to start at the top of the negative. Is everyone ready? Alright. They extend a lot of new ideas at the top of the debate. They extend it to no evidence, which tells you that 50% or whatever is all things, and then they talk about like the flexibility. But recognize that we would tell you that the round was over in second cross when they conceded that they're not going for FDCCU. What this ultimately means is that austerity cuts are the way you prioritize debt spending. That is the cleanest link to all of our arguments, because what that fundamentally means is if you prioritize reducing the debt, you cut healthcare by 30%, you cut SNAP by 50%, and that act gives us all our links. All their arguments about the debt to GDP ratio and prioritizing it in the long term doesn't make any sense, because paying the debt is always more than paying a percentage or the interest on the debt. On a comparative level, there's more cuts when you do and vote when you vote for the act. Now let's go into the arguments where we talk about like marginalized economies. They fundamentally have this new articulation of as to why it's racist. We would tell you that fundamentally the alternatives are always worse. By that logic, we would never invest in infrastructure spending and we would never help these inner city communities. If what we are arguing is true, then our statistics are, like empirically prove this up. That's why we tell you that infrastructure spending has reduced poverty by 25%, created 1.5 million jobs, particularly for those people in need and people of color who are high-paying jobs over the long term. But even more so, we would tell you that every $1 spent on infrastructure leads to $3 in economic output. At the end of the day, their turn doesn't make any sense because it's mitigatory at best. We would tell you that as a whole, infrastructure spending is a good thing. That's what the empirics back up. Now let's go into their case. Their only way that you could vote for them is if you believe that when the recession occurs, there would be no fiscal stimuli. But guess what? We link in because infrastructure spending is fiscal stimuli in times of recession. All of our arguments conclude that, and we would tell you, particularly through our SNAP evidence, that for $1 put into food stamps, that produces a $1.7 in economic output. But more specifically on infrastructure, we would tell you that historically, empirically, Isaac took a push, and he told you that when there was the recession and the Great Depression, that you answered that back with the New Deal. And we would tell you that the jobs created by infrastructure answer back all their claims to the recession. At the end of the day, if you believe that recessions will occur in either world, you vote for the negative for two reasons. One, because infrastructure helps. Two, because SNAP helps. And three, we create jobs which increase wages. Now let's do some explicit winning. We would tell you that if both of us impact recession, not only do we decrease the propensity of recession, but we decrease the probability of recessions happening in the future and solve that for them long term.